Welcome to this video on the arterial system of the body. This is the first part in a series on the arterial system where I'll be discussing the major vessels of the body. This is only an introduction and the arteries of each region will be discussed in detail in the upcoming videos. So let's begin with the heart. We have impure blood coming in to the right atrium, right ventricle, and then through the pulmonary trunk. Pure blood coming into the left atrium, left ventricle, and then through the aorta, and then it's distributed to the entire body. Now we'll start from the aorta itself. So first, let me give you a rough outline of what are all the major vessels in the body. First, we have the aorta. Just as we saw here, this is the aortic valve. We have an ascending aorta, an arch of the aorta. Now this arch of the aorta is what gives out three major vessels which supply your head and neck and the upper limb. Then the aorta starts to descend. This descending part here in the thorax is called the descending or the thoracic aorta. This supplies the thorax. Then we have the abdominal aorta. And these three dots are major trunks arising from the abdominal aorta which supply your viscera and other structures. This abdominal aorta goes on to split into common iliac arteries. Now these common iliac arteries again divide into internal and external iliac vessels. The internal iliac goes on to supply the pelvis and the perineal structures. The external iliac, on the other hand, continues as the femoral artery, and the femoral artery continues as the popliteal artery, which is in the knee. The popliteal artery divides into an anterior and a posterior tibial artery. So these are the major vessels. Let's take a closer look at them. Now first, we'll be seeing the aorta and its parts. As we just saw, this is the aorta. So we have the aortic valves, the ascending aorta, there's an arch, and then it becomes the descending aorta. First it's the thoracic and then the abdominal. Then the abdominal aorta divides into the common iliac vessels. The common iliac arteries. So these are the parts of the aorta. Now we'll start from the beginning, the ascending aorta itself. Now the area of the aortic valve, it has three cusps. So assuming this is the anterior view, this is the anterior portion, this is the posterior. The three cusps are the left, the right, and the posterior. They were to be arranged in a linear fashion. This is the image. So now we have a right cusp, a posterior, and a left. Now these two vessels coming from these two areas are the right coronary artery and the left coronary. So the aorta here, it has these cusps and we have three of them, left, right, and posterior. When you look at them closely, from the right we have a right coronary, and from the left we have the left coronary artery, and these are what give the blood supply to your heart. So we have the heart here. Now this is an anterior view of the heart. This is the aorta as we just saw. Now at the aorta, this is the right coronary artery. And this one in the dotted line is the left. Now I'm not going into details in any of these. This is just to show you how these vessels supply. I will be though discussing all of this in detail in the upcoming videos. So we have a right coronary artery which supplies the heart. We have a left coronary artery which supplies the side of the heart. Remember that I told you the arch of aorta gives off 3 major vessels which supply your head and neck and the upper limb. So let's look at these vessels closely. Now this is the blood supply of the upper limb coming from the arch of aorta. So we have the aorta and we have 3 vessels arising from here. As you can see, first we have a brachiocephalic trunk, then a left common carotid and a left subclavian. And the right common carotid and the right subclavian arise from the brachiocephalic trunk itself. Right now we are looking at the right side, the right upper limb. This here is the brachiocephalic trunk. Now the brachiocephalic trunk is dividing into a right common carotid and a right subclavian. Brachiocephalic trunk, a right common carotid and a right subclavian. The right subclavian gives out branches and the right subclavian continues into the axilla. So here it's called the axillary artery. So this is the right axillary. Now the axillary artery continues as the brachial artery. So here is the right brachial. The brachial artery supplies the arm. Axillary artery is supplying the axilla and the shoulder. And we have anastomosis, of course, which we will discuss later. The brachial artery continues and splits into a radial artery and an ulnar artery. So, a quick run through of your upper limbs major vessels, major arteries. The arch of aorta gives out the brachiocephalic trunk, or on the left side we have the left subclavian. So the brachiocephalic trunk here continues into the right common carotid and a right subclavian. The right subclavian travels and becomes the axillary artery. The same applies for the left. The subclavian continues, becomes the axillary artery. The axillary artery continues as the brachial artery. The brachial artery finally divides into the radial and ulnar arteries. Now these 2 arteries will enter the hand and form the palmar arches and supply the hand. Do not worry about these branches, we will be discussing them later in the subsequent videos. Now before going into the head and neck, let me tell you that the common carotid divides into an internal carotid and an external carotid. The external carotid goes on to supply the scalp and the face. The internal carotid, along with the vertebral artery from the subclavian, they supply the brain. So remember, we have the arch of aorta, we have a brachiocephalic trunk, a left common carotid and a left subclavian. These 3 are our major vessels. Now the brachiocephalic trunk gives out the right common carotid and the right subclavian. One of the branches of the subclavian which goes on to supply the head and neck is the vertebral artery. Now the vertebral artery is here and the common carotid, both the common carotids, they split into the internal and the external carotid arteries. And the internal carotid and the vertebral together supply the brain. This is an image of the base of the brain. Now you do not have to worry about any of this. We will be learning it in the subsequent videos as I mentioned before. But this is just to show you how these vessels are involved. Now these two streaks here, these two big lines, these are the vertebral arteries. They both combine and they form the basilar artery. And this here, this one and this vessel here, these two are the internal carotids. So as I mentioned just now, we have the internal carotids and the vertebral arteries, and these two together supply the brain. And this image here is showing the circle of Willis, and we will be covering all of this too. So let's recall what we've seen so far. So we saw at the ascending aorta, it gives out a left and a right coronary. So there's a right coronary, a left coronary, and they supply the heart. Then we saw that it continues as the arch of aorta, and the arch of the aorta gives out three vessels: a brachiocephalic trunk, a left and a right, left common carotid, and a left subclavian. And the brachiocephalic trunk divides into a right subclavian and a right common carotid, and the subclavian vessel continues and supplies the upper limb. So we're done with the ascending and the arch of aorta. Now we'll be seeing about the descending or the thoracic aorta. The descending aorta or the thoracic aorta is the part of this before the diaphragm. After the diaphragm, the aorta continues as the abdominal aorta and supplies the viscera there. Now here we have, these two are the coronary arteries. This is the brachiocephalic trunk, this is the left common carotid and the left subclavian. This here, the thoracic aorta, is giving out branches to the structures in the thorax, the esophagus, the bronchus, and the pericardium. These vessels here, these are the posterior intercostal arteries, and the last one is the subcostal artery. Again, you don't have to worry, I will be repeating all of this in detail, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm showing you this. Now, after the thoracic aorta has given off the intercostal arteries and branches to the mediastinum and other structures nearby, it descends below the diaphragm. It becomes the abdominal aorta. And these three branches, these three dots, are three important trunks arising from the abdominal aorta. This is the abdominal aorta, and it's dividing into the iliac arteries. Now the abdominal aorta gives out three trunks anteriorly. This is the celiac, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric. So we have three major trunks coming out from the anterior aspect: the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric trunk, and the inferior mesenteric. And these two are the renal vessels, the renal arteries. And we have, of course, other branches coming out of each of these trunks and these branches as well, but we will not discuss them here. Now the abdominal aorta, it divides into two common iliac arteries. And the common iliac divides into an internal and an external iliac. So we have the abdominal aorta. It's giving out three major trunks and the renal artery, and all of these branches supply the abdomen. It's dividing into two common iliac arteries. The common iliac divides into an external iliac and an internal iliac. Now this internal iliac supplies all of the pelvis and the perineum, and we'll be seeing that later. The external iliac continues as the femoral artery. This is for a better visualization. The abdominal aorta is here. It divides into a common iliac, internal iliac, and an external iliac. Now the external iliac goes on, continues as the femoral artery. Now what happens to the femoral artery itself? Here we have the external iliac continuing as the femoral artery. So we have the femoral artery, which is dividing into a descending genicular branch and the popliteal artery. Now the popliteal artery here continues behind the knee joint, and it divides into a posterior tibule and an anterior tibule. The external iliac continues as the femoral. It gives off a branch, the descending genicular, before continuing as the popliteal branch, the popliteal artery. The popliteal artery divides into the posterior and the anterior tibule. And these two vessels give out various branches which continue to supply the foot. If we were to write it, we have the ascending aorta, the arch of aorta, the descending of the thoracic aorta, the abdominal aorta. Now the ascending aorta, it gives out a right coronary artery and a left coronary artery. Now these two supply the heart. The arch of the aorta gives off three vessels. A brachiocephalic trunk, a left common carotid, and a left subclavian. The brachiocephalic trunk gives out a right subclavian and a right common carotid. The subclavian supplies the upper limb. The common carotids go on to supply the head and neck. Now the arch descends. We have the thoracic aorta. It supplies the thorax and all the mediastinal structures. The abdominal aorta gives off branches which supply the abdomen, and then it divides into common iliac arteries. Now each common iliac divides into an internal iliac and external iliac. The internal iliac goes on to supply the pelvis and perineum. The external iliac continues as the femoral artery. The femoral continues as the popliteal. The popliteal splits into anterior tibule and a posterior tibule. Then these two supply the leg and the foot. So this is the summary of what we have seen so far. All of the major arteries and which areas they supply. Thank you for watching this video, and if you liked it, please don't forget to subscribe.